Hello everyone, I'm Darcy Bono, and in this video I'm going to show you a few techniques and color schemes on how to paint the fabulous, flawless freak shows that are the Emperor's Children. So in 40k lore, the armor of the Emperor's Children is described as a cacophony of colors, like on this eye-searing noise marine that I painted a few months ago. Now obviously this doesn't appeal to everybody. This is incredibly intense. I literally used all of the brightest contrast paints and then enhanced them further with fluorescent paints. And we're going to touch on how to create very vibrant colors in just a moment. But because the Emperor's Children have such color potential, instead of doing a start to finish model, I'm going to give you several color schemes you can use, several techniques that you can apply to your own color schemes and your own miniatures, so you can pick and choose what colors work best for you. So looking at the color scheme on the box art, what you have are very vibrant colors like this intense pink, but then it's balanced by the dark neutral portions such as the black, the muted metallics on the trim. So it is kind of a balancing act between the intense and the dark. So it's a little bit easier to look at, but still remains flavorful. So first, let's start off with making this more neutral background on which you can then create your brighter accents. First things first, I'm going to recommend that you prime your miniature white. Even if you plan on having a significant amount of black armor, it's much easier to paint black over a lighter color than it is to try and paint a lighter color like pink over black. So for that reason, we're going to start with white. This white foundation is going to make our accent colors like our pinks, our oranges, our purples, whatever you choose, it's going to make them really pop because they're going to be sitting over a much brighter light surface. So for the black surfaces, I'm using Army Painter Speed Paint Grim Black. It's almost identical in color to the Citadel Black Templar contrast paint. However, I have found that it does go on much more smoothly. If you've seen some of my other tutorials, you'll know that you can smooth out contrast paints very easily, but you do have to apply a layer of medium first. I like to use Lamian medium as it gives the paint a bit more flow, but basically you have to put that down first, then apply your contrast paint immediately after while that medium's still wet, and then kind of mop with it. You don't have to do that with speed paints quite as much unless it's a much larger surface, but I've just found the color application for basic Space Marine armor is just an easier process using Army Painter speed paints. And honestly, that's pretty much all I do for the black armor. The contrast paint does its work and creates a light tone on the edges while creating a mid-tone black on the raised portions and a deep black in the recesses. If you want to add an edge highlight, I recommend something like Fenrisian Gray. Any kind of grayish, bluish green color looks great on these edges. It just keeps it a cool black while giving you a little bit more definition. That being said, let's get some rave-worthy, crazy colors on these pauldrons. And don't worry, we're going to paint this metallic purple trim as well. As I mentioned earlier, the key to vibrant colors is a white foundation, so do whatever design you want using white. I really like to use ACRYL Bold Titanium White. It is very opaque. Even over black, it gives you a nice bright white foundation. So create whatever design that you want using white. And the tool that you're going to use for this honestly depends on what design you're going for. One of the easiest, most effective tools you can use is just a piece of cheap sponge. This is great for making that kind of black light splatter paint effect. You just want to get most of the paint off your sponge first, and you can even make a cool kind of like slashing, streaking comet, even claw mark effect with it just by swiping it very lightly across the surface. And once you have that white pattern down, that's when the fun begins. Using some of the most vibrant contrast paints in the range, you can very easily get an explosion of color. In this case, I'm using Doomfire Magenta as it creates a very intense hot pink when applied over white. I do thin it quite a bit, probably in about a 1:2 ratio of paint to Lamian medium. It just thins it a little bit more than contrast medium does and allows that white underlayer to show through very brightly. And then I just lightly swipe that over top of my white pattern. Heaven forbid if you get any of it on the black, it's likely not even going to be very visible, and if it is, it's just a slight tinge. So you can either wipe it away while it's still wet or keep it on there because the Emperor's Children are a bunch of hot messes. And in order to take the color intensity up a notch, you can always play around with fluorescent paints. Both Pro Acryl by Monument Hobbies and Huge Miniatures have fantastic ranges of fluorescent paint. Huge Miniatures is a bit more opaque, so it gives that instant, intense finish, while Pro Acryls is more transparent, which is great for blending. So again, just setting up that bright foundation, adding a few white spots here and there, generally to the center of these dots, and allowing it to dry before applying a layer of huge miniatures cyber pink. And if you want to get really crazy with it, ACRYL does have a fluorescent yellow that's not too green that actually blends beautifully with this bright pink. It makes a very kind of cosmic orange tinge right where the two colors meet because it's the yellow meeting the red of the pink. So I'll just lightly spot that over the fluorescent pink and it just gives you a very bright color variation. Another cool trick you can try to keep your Emperor's Children nice and colorful is to create a color gradient. This is very easily achieved simply by following the color wheel. This Tzeentch horror, this prismatic horror, was done entirely with contrast paints. They were augmented a little with fluorescence, but the overall scheme was done simply by just following the color wheel. And by that I mean you're just looking at where the colors meet. So you've got a yellow-green that then fades into green, that then fades into blue-green. And in order to create this color gradient using contrast paints, this is the contrast paint example of that. We've got our striking scorpion green, that's our yellow green. We put Kroxigor scales, a blue green, at the bottom. I applied a tiny dab of striking scorpion again right there in the middle so it would meet with the Kroxigor scales and create a mid green. And now you've got a fun, interesting color transition using just two colors applied over white. So that's how you can paint some crazy vibrant colors over black to create some very interesting contrast. Next, let's move on to the trim. Since we're working with pinks and purples and teals, I recommend a more neutral color because it will go with everything. So if you want something a bit more balanced but still eclectic, try gunmetals and muted golds around your brighter colors. Regardless of whether you are doing silver or gold, I always start with a silver base coat, and this will make sense later when I show you how to paint gold. But for the silver, I'm using Vallejo Game Air Silver. It's just very opaque, very smooth, and a very fine grit. It can be kind of hard to find, so you can always use something like Citadel's Runefang Steel, but basically just any bright silver will work. We're going to create a little bit of shading and calm this down a little bit by using the exact same black that we used before, so whether it was Grim Black or Black Templar. In this case, I mixed Grim Black in an even ratio with Lamian Medium, as it'll make the paint much more transparent and allow it to flow more into the recesses. This will result in a cool, dark steel. And if you would like to add a Slaaneshi purple hue to this metal, you can do so simply by applying a shade of Druchii Violet. I generally will do a quick swipe of Lamian Medium first. This will allow the shade coat to sink in near those rivets instead of coating the whole surface. So while that's still wet, I'll then apply a heavy dose of Druchii Violet and then lightly spread it around. And this violet shade is very transparent, so you can afford to be pretty heavy-handed with this. If you'd like additional saturation, feel free to go back in for a second coat of it if you'd like it to be a bit more purple. And speaking of purple, let's do the traditional pale metallic purple with gold combination that is seen throughout the codex. This is very simple. You're going to start with an entirely bright silver surface. This is a pauldron that has been primed with Vallejo Silver Spray. You do not have to do it like this. So long as you start with a bright silver base, you can prime it whatever color you want. I recommend white, so your silver is very bright. And then you can just paint something like Runefang Steel over top of that. Once you've got your bright silver on there, let it dry, and then you're going to apply just a very thin layer of Lamian Medium. And again, I use this just to let the paint diffuse so it doesn't automatically stick to the surface and start to pool. This will help it spread out more evenly so you don't get any oversaturation. So while that Lamian Medium is still wet, I immediately apply my gold mixture. This is Aggaros Dunes and Fireslayer Flesh mixed in a 3:1 ratio. This will give you a nice light mid-tone gold that's not quite as heavily saturated as something like Retributor Gold. Essentially what I'm doing is just applying a little bit at a time, rinsing my brush, and then using my brush like a spatula to just kind of spread it out until you get that paler gold color. And once it's dry, it'll look something like this. Now what we're going to do next is just do a very thin recess shade of purple. In this case, I'm going to use Luxian Purple Contrast. It's much more heavily pigmented than Druchii Violet. It's also a slightly cooler purple, meaning it has a little bit more blue in it. So feel free to use whichever one you want. I just wanted to show you that this has more color saturation, so you don't really have to build it up very much. So same thing as before, we are going to swipe a thin layer of Lamian medium over this pauldron, specifically focusing in the recesses, but also just applying a tiny thin layer to the center. This will allow us to easily feather out our purple and create a smooth gradient, and this will make more sense once you see it. So all I'm doing is mixing Luxian purple and Lamian medium in an even ratio just to thin it down a little bit. We don't want this too saturated. And then I just lightly apply it to the recesses, and you can be as heavy-handed with this as you want. As you can see, starting out, I'm doing just a very fine little line, just so you have that slight purple hue, and then I'm bringing it out closer to the center. Now, you're going to see me go much more heavy-handed with this. I just wanted to show you how much control you have with this Lamian medium in the recesses. So in just a sec, you're going to see why having that wet-on-wet blending is important. So we've got Lamian medium, it's still wet in there, I'm being much more heavy-handed, and you can see it diffuse as soon as it hits that wet surface. And because this paint isn't automatically sticking to a dry surface, I'm able to rinse my brush and then push around the excess paint where I want it to be, or wipe it away completely. And just like that, with literally no effort, we have a very nice purple hue on our silver pauldron. And let's do one more purple color scheme. By popular demand, here is how to very easily paint the Emperor's Children HORUS HERESY color scheme. Starting with a black base coat, we're then going to heavily dry brush and stipple using the same bright silver you saw before. To do this, I'm using a rounded tip dry brush. You don't need anything fancy for this. This is actually a makeup brush, a ELF concealer brush. I lightly just jab the miniature to create a stippled pattern. You want to do this fairly heavily, but still have a blackish tinge to the recesses of your armor. Next, we're going to do the silver trim that is going to turn into gold in just a moment. To do that, just apply a silver base coat to your trim and then just let it dry. Then we're going to do our purple first because it is a very dark color and we don't want to get that on our gold. This is Leviathan Purple Contrast. It's one of the very dense, very opaque contrast paints, so I recommend thinning it quite a bit, between 1 drop of paint and 3 drops of Lamian medium, possibly 4 if you want more of a metallic finish, more of that metallic underlayer showing through. So thin it quite a bit and then lightly swipe it over top of your silver. And then just let that dry before moving on to the gold trim. To create our gold, we're going to do the exact same thing we did for the last gold, apply Lamian medium just so it spreads out a bit more evenly. Then we just immediately rinse our brush and start to apply Skeleton Horde contrast over top of this Lamian medium. The more thinly you apply this, the more the silver underlayer is going to show through, so the lighter and paler your gold is going to be. If you'd like to shade this a little bit in the recesses, especially around the rivets, you can dull down the shadows with either Rattling Grime or even Nuln Oil. Any kind of brown-gray wash will desaturate this further and give you a little bit more of a shadow tone. And if you want to edge highlight, I highly recommend just mixing silver into your Skeleton Horde, and it makes essentially the metallic version of khaki, and running that along the edges. Alternatively, if you don't feel like mixing colors, you can just pick up something like Army Painter True Brass. This is a perfect highlight color for this highly desaturated gold. And if you would like to apply an edge highlight to your metallic purple, it's the exact same premise. Mix your silver with your Leviathan purple. The degree to which you do this is going to depend on how light you want this to be. If you want it to be very light, mix in more silver. And again, Leviathan purple is deeply saturated, so a little goes a long way. So just test it out on paper beforehand. But either way, once you have your light metallic purple, just run it along the edges. Okay, we've done purple, we've done gold, time for some pink. Now, in all honesty, I'm not very familiar with painting pink, unless I'm painting the inside of a monster's mouth or someone who has become the latest fashion accessory for a Night Lord. I'm almost never using pink. So we'll just title this section, What Darcy Learned While She Was Figuring Out How to Paint Pink. So the first thing I learned was that most, if not all, of the Citadel range either is very burgundy or just very purple. There's just not many bright pastel pinks, with the exception of Fulgrim Pink, which is a very transparent paint that takes a few coats in order to bring up the vibrancy. However, if you'd like more of the box art pink like you see in the Codex, I highly recommend applying Army Painter Speed Paint Princess Pink over a white surface. So here's why this is my go-to paint for painting Emperor's Children pink. Here is a Power Fist, nothing to read into there, and it instantly provides a just beautiful, bright pastel pink, complete with highlights in just a single coat. This is thinned in about a 3-to-1 ratio of paint to thinner. You don't have to put thinner in there. I just like to do it because it gives me a little bit more of a light pink. Feel free to use it straight from the bottle. It diffuses fairly well on its own. The Lamian medium does push it into the recesses quite a bit, and I'm applying this very haphazardly, so just make sure to keep an eye on the pooling in the recesses and use a damp brush to soak up any excessive saturation. So this is what it looks like once it's completely dried. I'm going to show you how you can shade this and add a little bit more definition to it, as well as how to paint gold with your pink. So one thing I quickly learned while I was painting pink was that it looks infinitely better with a desaturated gold like we painted in our HORUS Heresy trim. The trim you see here was done with the exact same color recipe, the skeleton horde contrast over silver technique. Try to avoid using rich yellow golds with pink. It just ends up looking like a drunken bachelorette party went to a nail salon, which is fine because this is Emperor's Children, Slaaneshi, that fits the bill perfectly, but it could be unpleasant to look at when applied to an entire army, especially if pink is your predominant color. But keep in mind, this is just personal preference. If you do want to use a rich gold with your pink, please feel free to do so. It does look particularly good when separated with black. So really quickly, we'll wrap this up in just a sec, but I did want to show you how to shade and add a little bit of definition to your pink armor. So you've got a few fun options for how you paint your shadows. Regardless of the color I choose, I generally will run, you guessed it, Lamian medium in these more pronounced recesses, so the paint will very easily fill them. If you'd like cooler undertones, I recommend using Luxian purple, because again, it is a cool purple that will turn into a mid purple once it hits this warmer pink. It creates a nice amount of contrast and definition due to it being darker as well. So I recommend using that if you would like some color variation as well as darker shadows. Alternatively, if you'd like to intensify this pink but still retain deep saturation in the recesses, just do the same thing we did before, line them with Lamian medium, but then apply Vulpes pink. Vulpes pink is essentially just a transparent burgundy, but it will make your lighter pale pink really pop. It also looks gorgeous next to this pale gold. And one final way you can add a little color variation, you can turn this into a very beautiful sunset pink, is just apply a thin shade of orange. This is just Fuegan orange shade, I think that I said that correctly, and it makes this very beautiful salmon pink. So we've seen the Slaaneshi colors. Let's finish this guide with a tacky design of pink zebra stripes. So we have our thin princess pink glaze of pink over white, and we have our dark steel made from grim black over silver. Turn the pauldron to a slight angle just so I had to basically just move my hand down and it would be at a natural kind of slanted angle. And this is just Magos purple, not even thinned. It's already a fairly thin contrast paint. You can use whatever darker burgundy you want. Vulpes pink, Carroburg crimson, even Doomfire magenta would look intense on this, but I wanted it to be just slightly more subtle. But yeah, basically just made light wiggly stripes by looking at a picture of zebra stripes on Google. So those are all the ideas I had when it comes to painting Emperor's Children. You may have noticed I did not cover the one in the center, and that's because there's already a YouTube reel on that. If I'm able to link it in the next suggested video, I will, but otherwise it's in the video description. It's a quick 3-minute tutorial on how I painted that. I hope you enjoyed this video. This was quite a wild ride for me because I usually don't paint in most of these tones. Let me know what you liked. Let me know what color schemes you have in mind, which ones you found the most helpful. I love armies that have so much color potential like this one does. So I'm very excited to hear what you guys have in mind for your own Emperor's Children. And if you really enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, of course. But if you found it particularly helpful and you would like to support the channel, please hit the super thanks button. It basically functions as a tip jar. It's there on your YouTube interface. So I really appreciate any support you guys send my way. So thanks very much for joining me, and until we meet again, happy painting, everyone.